Alright, this is the direct continuation of the previous video. So we left off talking about the Code of Hammurabi over here. Now it's clear from the Code of Hammurabi that this was a normal thing to be done in the time of the Avot, where someone whose wife couldn't give birth might give her husband a maidservant, and the maid would assume equality, right? She would get an equal status with the husband according to the Code of Hammurabi, and she'd have the same status as the other wife because she gave him a child. However, he could keep her as a slave, reckoning her among the maidservants. So some people have looked at the story and said that if this law from Code of Hammurabi represents a widespread practice in the time of the Avot, it might shed light on the question of whether Avraham or Sarah was more in the right here. And specifically, maybe Sarah comes out looking better now because Hagar could attain equal status with her, but it was the man's choice to perhaps say that the maidservant should go back to being a slave like the other maidservants rather than having status of the wife. And this choice would have been the man's choice. So maybe then goes the argument, if we look back over here at the different Meforshim, maybe Rashi is right that Sarah has a claim here. Avram, you see me being humiliated. It's your responsibility to decide whether Hagar gets to be an equal wife because she has your kid, or whether she should be demoted. And so Sarah maybe has a right to be upset when Avram's not doing anything. And then when Avram says to her, here's your maidservant, do whatever you want, Avram finally is demoting her. And so when Sara then is mishaberet babakoshi, vata'neh sarai, when Sara then oppresses or works Hagar hard, she's simply like restoring the normal order of things that the slave would have to be returned to her maidservant status because the man said so. So again, some people have used this to argue in favor of Sarah, that Sarah is simply acting in accordance with the laws and customs of that time. On the other hand, we mentioned in class that Nachum Leibowitz was very opposed to this approach. Nachum Leibowitz said, like, why are we using the Code of Hammurabi or any other law as our yardstick? Even if we'll agree that it was legal at that time, so what? Lots of things were legal according to the Code of Hammurabi. According to the Code of Hammurabi, if I build a house, and God forbid that house collapses and kills somebody's family who is inside of it because I did a poor construction job, since I killed that person's kids, the appropriate punishment is to take my kids and kill them. I think we all know the Torah does not allow for that. In fact, the Torah says the opposite. The Torah in Devarim says, Lo yumtu avot al banim, uvanim lo yumtu al avot. Fathers can't be punished for their sons' crimes, sons can't be punished for their fathers' crimes. And so it says in Nachum Leibowitz, I don't care what it says in the Code of Hammurabi. The Code of Hammurabi could tell us that what Sarah did is totally legal, and that in no way addresses the question of whether it was ethical, because the laws at that time, in many cases, were unethical. If you see an Egyptian beating a Jew in Mitzrayim, you might say, oh, well, that's fine, because the Jews were slaves at that time. And yet, when Moshe stands up for a Jew and fights back, we're all proud of him and say, good for you, Moshe, you stood up for a Jew and didn't let the guy get beaten up. Who cares if Paro said it was legal for the Jews to be persecuted and beaten up there? But it wasn't right. And I think Radak is actually trying to be somewhat nuanced here. If you look back at what Radak said, he never contested the legality of what Sarah did. He didn't know the Code of Hammurabi. He just knew in general that people were allowed to beat slaves back then. But we can add to that what we know today, that what Sarah did was also in accordance with the customs and norms of their society in the Code of Hammurabi for how to treat a slave who gives birth to her master's kid, but the master then wants to demote her back to being a slave. So according to those customs, what Sarah did was fine. But I think it's still fair to say it was lo midat musar v'lo midat chasidut. It still wasn't the ethical thing to do. It still may reflect poorly on Sarah in terms of whether she's a pious person, and we do like to think of Sarah as a person of chassidut, or we call it tzadeket, and it may reflect poorly on her in that situation to oppress her slave, even if it was completely legal. I mean, we know all the Avot owned slaves, that was part of the world back then, but I think we generally have an impression of them that they treated their slaves relatively humanely. Avram certainly seems to treat Eliezer decently, and so I understand today we think it's wrong to own slaves at all, but given the time and place where they lived, we like to think they at least were decent enough people, they didn't mistreat their slaves. And when we think of mistreating slaves, we mean that they didn't, beat them or abuse them, even though those things were legal in those days. And so I think Radak's point here, on the one hand, we shouldn't overly pile it on Sara and vilify her because she was acting in a way that was normal for people in that time and place. Nevertheless, Radak is still disappointed in her because for Sara Imenu, we don't simply want her to act in a way that was considered reasonable for someone in that time and place, but we also want her to act in accordance with Midat Musar and Midat Chasidut. And so that's where Radak comes down different than Rashi. Rashi emphasizes how much Sara was suffering and how, in Rashi's view, maybe Avram didn't support her enough. And so Rashi really makes you feel in the end like when Sara sends Hagar to work extra hard, Hagar has it coming to her, and that's how Sara did what she had to do, and good for her. And her Sament's article that I had you read, sort of in a longer, more sophisticated way, develops this theme based on Rashi. But Radak pushes back here, and Radak says, no, what she did was legal, let's not vilify her, and she's not a serial killer, she didn't do anything that in those days would have been seen as deeply immoral. But nevertheless, the Torah's goal is for people to also live by Midat Musar and Midat Chasidut, and so much so that Radak says towards the end of the story that in fact the purpose of this story is to teach us that even when things are allowed in a particular society, Kol Zeh HaSipur Nichtav BaTorah. This whole story was written in the Torah. Liknot Adam Mimenu Midot Tovot L'Archik Hara'ot. For someone to acquire the good midot and push away the bad ones, to say, even though I understand that everything Sarah did was legal, the better midot would be to support better midot would be to not engage in what Sarah did, to not oppress your slave. And that's why ultimately we are told later on, when the angel finds Hagar out in the wilderness, Shama Hashem Eloniach, Hashem heard your suffering. Hashem's going to reward you for going back to Hagar. According to Radak, the reason Hashem is supportive of Hagar, even though Hagar is no saint, right? Hagar is somebody who said some very mean things to Sarah and gloated over her that she could have a baby and Sarah couldn't. Nevertheless, Hashem is going to support Hagar here because Hashem feels bad for the suffering that Hagar went through. So just to sum up what we saw, the type of thing I might ask you about in a test would be to compare Rashi and Radak's approaches here. Rashi has an approach which thinks Abraham did some things that were wrong, and therefore Rashi is especially sensitive to Sarah's position here and tries to sort of downplay the severity of the way that Sarah oppressed Hagar, and other than that, tries to play up everything that Sarah did nicely. In addition to what we saw in the last video about comparing Rashi and Radak, we had our original Rashi video where we saw how Rashi believes that Sarah has Ruach HaKodesh and was guided by that in this story, and so Rashi has a very favorable view of Sarah here. Radak, on the other hand, feels that Avraham really didn't do anything that bad here. Yeah, maybe he didn't daven for her, but then again, maybe he did, and Hashem didn't listen to him. Avraham, maybe wasn't so aware of what Hagar was doing, but there's no way that Avraham would have been aware and just ignored it. And so Radak thinks Avraham really didn't do anything wrong here, but by reaching that conclusion, if Avraham didn't do anything wrong, then it makes Sarah look much worse over here. That Sarah is blaming Avraham perhaps unfairly, and more than that, Radak thinks that Sarah is really piling on the oppression of Hagar, not only working her with hard labor, but perhaps even beating her and cursing her, all of which was legal in those days if you owned a slave, all of which we saw according to the Code of Hammurabi was seen as part of the norms of society. If the master had this slave woman bear him a child, but then wanted to put the slave back in her place because she was being too arrogant. Nevertheless, I think even if you'd show Radak the Code of Hammurabi and show him black and white how what Sarah did was legal, he'd return to the same thing that he anyway said, which is, yes, it was legal, but it was not Midat Musar and was not Midat Chasidut.